a prestigious academy, a gifted black student, and a system determined to hold her back. When Amara was forced to showcase her talent in front of the entire class, her teacher expected failure. Her classmates expected humiliation. But what happened? Next was something no one saw coming. She didn't just play the piano, she... March in New York. The lingering chill of winter still clung to the air, but the first rays of spring sunlight stretched across the city's cobblestone streets. Outside the gates of an elite private school, sleek luxury cars pulled up with seamless precision, like actors hitting their marks in a perfectly choreographed play. Drivers in tailored suits stepped out, opening doors with practiced ease as students emerged, exuding effortless confidence. Amara Sullivan stood at the edge of the school entrance, gripping the strap of her worn-out backpack. The faded fabric, frayed at the edges, stood in stark contrast to the polished scene around her. Her eyes flicked over designer handbags, gleaming shoes, and meticulously styled hair. Everything about them was uniform, like they had all stepped out of the same mold. No one had to say it, but she knew. She didn't belong here. She inhaled deeply, reminding herself that she had earned her place at this school. A full scholarship. She wasn't an outsider. And yet, the feeling clung to her, shadowing her every step. Nearby, a trio of girls stood together, 3 blondes in immaculate uniforms. Their eyes swept over Amara, their gazes quick and cutting, like a stain had appeared on their pristine world. One of them, Charlotte Hayes, daughter of a hedge fund CEO, smirked, tucking a strand of golden hair behind her ear before leaning in to whisper, "Did she get lost on the way here?" The words weren't loud, but they reached Amira's ears with pinpoint precision. The other 2 girls giggled behind their hands. Amara didn't turn, didn't react, but she could feel their eyes dissecting her, taking in the jacket that had seen better days, the sneakers that weren't a high-end brand, the simple ponytail that lacked the polished curls of wealth. She tightened her grip on her backpack strap and walked faster. Inside, the school gleamed like a 5-star hotel. Marble floors reflected the warm golden glow of chandeliers. Wide hallways stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of benefactors whose smiles held the serenity of those who had never known struggle. She made her way to the music room, one of the school's most prestigious classrooms. Grand Steinway and Sons. Pianos lined the far wall, their glossy surfaces gleaming under the lights. At the front of the room, Vincent Aldridge, the music instructor, was in the middle of his lecture. He carried himself with effortless poise, his gray suit tailored to perfection, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed back. When he spoke about the essence of classical music, his voice held a quiet reverence, as if this wasn't merely a subject, but a sacred knowledge reserved for the chosen few. Classical music is more than just notes, Vincent said, his voice echoing through the room. It is the inheritance of a civilization. It requires discipline, rigor, and, above all, a proper foundation. A few students nodded, scribbling in their leather-bound notebooks. Amara sat still, hands resting in her lap. "Now," Vincent continued, "who here can share their journey with music? Who has been trained since childhood?" A boy in the front row raised his hand. "I've played violin since I was 4. A girl followed. "I started piano at 3. My instructor is a soloist at Carnegie Hall." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Excellent." His gaze swept the room, pausing, almost hesitantly, on Amara. "And you, Lawson?" All eyes turned toward her. She steadied her voice. I taught myself. I practiced on the piano at my neighborhood church. A pause. Vincent blinked, as if uncertain he had heard correctly. A flicker of amusement, almost condescending, crossed his face. "Ha, so you've had a very personal approach to classical music." A few soft chuckles rippled through the room, not outright laughter. No one said, "You don't belong here," but Amara understood. It was in Vincent's tone. It was in the glances exchanged around her, the half-smirks, the quick looks before turning away. She curled her fingers into her palms. Vincent had already moved on, facing the board as if her answer had never been spoken. Amara lowered her gaze to her hands, her fingers so familiar with the weight of piano keys, with the dim glow of candlelight in the church as her music filled the empty space. She knew what she was capable of, but in this room, among these people, she was nothing more than a misplaced note in a symphony already composed. The notes still echoed in Amira's mind as she closed the piano lid in the empty music room. A week had passed since that class, yet the feeling of isolation clung to her like a shadow. In the days that followed, she buried herself in practice, each note a silent affirmation. She didn't need prestige. She didn't need validation from people who believed talent only belonged to those born into privilege. She just needed a chance, and that chance was coming. The school's piano competition was a major event. To be selected meant performing on the main stage in front of hundreds, renowned judges, representatives from top music conservatories. For Amara, this wasn't just a competition. It was a path to the future. That morning, she opened her email. Heart pounding, her eyes scanned the list. Charlotte Hayes, William Sterling, Alexandra Monroe, but not Amara Lawson. She frowned, scrolling down. Still not there. She blinked, a cold weight settling in her chest. No, that can't be right. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled to the bottom of the email. A single line, in small, impersonal text. If you do not see your name on this list, it means you were not selected. No explanation, no reason. It felt like a door had been slammed in her face. She inhaled sharply, then stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor as she strode out of the library. Each step echoed through the grand hallways. Outside, the spring sky was bright and clear, but inside her, a storm raged. She didn't have to guess. She knew exactly who had done this. Vincent Aldridge's office was quiet when Amara stepped in. The faint scent of Earl Grey tea lingered in the air. On the polished mahogany desk, a fine porcelain cup steamed gently. Vincent stood near the window, slowly flipping through the pages of a music book before turning to face her. He didn't look surprised. Lawson. His voice was calm, measured. He set the book down and poured himself more tea. "What can I do for you?" Amara clenched her fingers into her palm, forcing herself to stay composed. "I wasn't on the list for the competition." Vincent lifted his cup, blew softly across the rim. "Correct." One word. Simple. Without explanation. Amara took a steady breath, meeting his gaze. "Why?" Vincent placed the cup down, his expression unreadable. He glanced at a folder on his desk, flipping through its pages as if to emphasize his next words. "These competitions require extensive preparation," he said smoothly. "I'm sure you understand." She did. His words weren't about preparation. They were a reminder. A line she wasn't allowed to cross. A slow, burning anger rose in her chest. But she refused to let it show. She wouldn't let him see her break. She pressed her lips together, her voice steady. "Sir, I am more than capable." For the first time since she entered, Vincent laughed. A quiet, deliberate chuckle, like he was savoring the moment. "Lawson," he mused, leaning back. In his chair, "I don't doubt that." Then he set the list aside, folded his hands, and smiled. "But I believe you might be better suited for other stages." Silence settled over the room. The weight of his words sank deep. Other stages. He didn't have to say it outright. She had heard it before, in different ways, from different mouths. Perhaps gospel music is more your style. Maybe you should explore genres that reflect your background. Competitions like this aren't for everyone. No one said it plainly, but she always understood. Amira held his gaze. "So you're saying this stage isn't meant for me?" Vincent didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his tea, as if weighing his words. Then he smiled. "Lawson, you're smart. I'm sure you understand what I mean." She stared at him, the fury simmering beneath her skin, controlled but unyielding. "So this isn't about ability?" Vincent didn't respond. She nodded slowly, her silence sharp as a blade. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. The moment the door shut behind her, her hands curled into fists. She had expected this, but knowing it would happen, and standing in the face of it, were two entirely different things. Her breath was uneven as she walked down the hallway, but she didn't care who saw her. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't let Vincent decide her fate. She would find another way, no matter what it took. Amira left the school, her steps quicker than usual. The New York sky had darkened, towering skyscrapers rising like silent giants, their golden lights reflecting off the damp brick sidewalks. She pulled out her phone. Nothing. No messages. No revised email correcting the competition list. No acknowledgement that a mistake had been made. She gripped the strap of her backpack. No, she wouldn't let it end like this. If they refused to give her a chance, she would create one for herself. Her pace quickened as she wove through the crowded sidewalk. Cars honked. Footsteps overlapped in a chaotic rhythm. But in Amira's mind, there was only the sound of the piano. When she reached the subway station, the Brooklyn-bound train had just arrived. She pushed into the packed car, her fingers tightening around the cold metal pole. A woman beside her, hair in a tight bun, scrolled through her phone without looking up. A man in a gray suit, his face hollowed by exhaustion, sat in the corner, with his eyes half closed. She recognized this feeling, the weight of people too busy living to stop and complain. She inhaled deeply. The church. She needed music. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked softly as Amira pushed them open. Inside, it was dim and quiet, the glow of small lamps casting gentle light over rows of wooden pews. The air carried a slight chill, but Amira was used to it. She set down her backpack, removed her gloves, and made her way to the piano tucked into the corner. Her fingers skimmed over the lid. She lifted it, revealing the black and white keys beneath. No, Vincent Aldridge. No erased names. No judgmental stares. Just her and the music. Amira inhaled deeply, closed her eyes, and placed her hands on the keys. The first note rang out, clear, slow, like raindrops falling into a still lake. She didn't play from sheet music. She let her fingers guide her, pouring every buried emotion into the melody. She played her frustration, the anger she had swallowed, the faith she refused to lose. The low notes thudded like her footsteps echoing through the school's cold hallways. The high notes pierced the air like whispered taunts from her classmates, and in between, the pauses. The silent spaces between notes, like the emptiness inside her. She didn't know how long she played, but when the final note lingered and dissolved into the quiet, a voice spoke from the doorway. "You have a gift. No one has the right to take away." Amira's heart jolted. She turned. A woman stood there, draped in a long wool coat, silver-streaked hair neatly pulled back. Her eyes held something rare, not just admiration, but recognition. Mrs. Helen, one of the school's senior teachers, and more importantly, a former judge of the very competition Amira had been erased from. Amira had no idea how long she had been standing there. She also didn't know what to say. Mrs. Helen stepped forward, gaze still fixed on the piano. "I've heard many students play," she said, her voice low but steady. "But very few play like you." Amira remained silent. "You taught yourself, didn't you?" Mrs. Helen asked. Amira nodded. Mrs. Helen slowly nodded back. She didn't ask why Amira's name wasn't on the list. She didn't ask why she was here, practicing alone late at night. She only said one thing: "I'm going to help you." And for the first time all week, Amira felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Amira walked through the school gates with a different feeling. Not fear, not doubt. Determination. Mrs. Helen had promised to help her, and she was not the kind of person who made empty promises as Amira approached Vincent Aldridge's office. Mrs. Helen was already there, standing tall, hands clasped in front of her. She didn't ask if Amira was ready, because that wasn't a question that needed asking. They stepped inside together. The office was bathed in soft morning light. From the large window, a portrait of Chopin hung on the wall, next to a bookshelf lined with leather-bound classical scores. Everything in the room exuded order, discipline, and a coldness that was difficult to name. Vincent sat behind his desk, sipping tea as if everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. But when he saw Mrs. Helen walk in with Amira, he set his cup down. A flicker of something sharp flashed through his gray-blue eyes before his face returned to its usual mask of calm. Mrs. Helen wasted no time. "Vincent," she said, her voice steady, firm, "I want Amira to compete in the recital." A tense silence settled over the room. Vincent looked at her, then at Amira. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. And then he smiled. Not a kind smile. The smile of a man who believed he was still in control. "Mrs. Helen," he said, his tone light, almost conversational. "Have you heard her play?" Mrs. Helen didn't blink. "I have." Vincent nodded slowly, as if considering something. He turned his gaze back to Amira, his eyes scanning her like she was an incomplete piece of music. And then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he said, "She can play. But does she truly understand classical music?" The question sliced through the air like a razor. Amira didn't flinch. She knew what this was. A test. A trap disguised as an innocent inquiry. He didn't expect her to answer. He just wanted to prove she didn't belong, but she didn't back down. She stepped forward, meeting his gaze head-on. Her voice was steady. "You don't need to teach me how to understand music." The words rang out, sharp and unwavering. A flicker of something passed through Vincent's face. Mrs. Helen raised an eyebrow. Vincent blinked once. The smile on his lips faded slightly. "Oh?" He tilted his head, his tone now laced with amusement. "Then tell me." What is classical music, really? Amira clenched her hands slightly, but her expression didn't waver. She took a slow breath. Then she spoke. It's emotion. Vincent's eyebrow arched, but he didn't interrupt. Amira continued. It's a story told without words. It's something that reaches people, no matter who they are or where they come from. She paused for a beat, then added, It doesn't belong to any one class of people. Vincent leaned back in his chair. The amusement in his eyes was gone, replaced by something colder. A nice theory, he mused, voice edged with condescension. But theory alone won't keep you standing on stage. Mrs. Helen's voice cut in, sharp and unwavering. Then let her prove it, Vincent. Vincent lifted his cup again, but didn't drink. He studied Amira for a long moment, then set it down. And then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Very well. He pushed his chair back and stood. She can compete. Amira's face remained unreadable, but she could feel her pulse pounding beneath her skin. Vincent looked at her one last time, and then, with a cold, measured smile, he said, I just hope you don't disappoint me. Amira didn't blink. She knew. This wasn't a victory. It was just the beginning. April's pale gray sky draped a thin veil of mist over New York's towering skyline. The air was crisp, the cold wind slicing through the streets like invisible fingers tightening around the city's breath. But Amira didn't feel the cold. Inside her, a fire was burning. She had made it here, despite the whispers, despite the doubt-laced stares, despite the invisible walls built to keep her from stepping through this very door. But they were wrong. She would play. She would take that stage, and they, all of them, would have to listen. The school's grand auditorium was one of the most extravagant places Amira had ever seen. Deep red velvet draped the walls, creating an air of both elegance and suffocation. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, glittering with opulent chandeliers casting soft golden light. The stage was vast, its polished wooden floor gleaming under the glow of the overhead spotlights. Everything about this place was a reminder, a quiet declaration that it belonged to the privileged, and at the very center of the stage stood the grand piano, a Steinway and Sons, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a symbol of perfection. But to Amira, it was also a challenge. The audience settled into their seats, students in pristine uniforms, parents sitting with arms crossed, their gazes filled with quiet pride for their children. The panel of judges sat in the front row, clipboards resting on their laps. Some of them murmured to each other in hushed tones, occasionally glancing up at the stage. Vincent Aldridge was among them, his legs crossed, his arm draped lazily over the chair's armrest, but his eyes cold, sharp. Like a blade, he wasn't worried. If anything, he looked like a man waiting for something inevitable. Amira stepped onto the stage. Each footstep echoed against the polished floor, loud and clear in the vast room. Her heart pounded. Not from fear, not from nerves, from readiness. This was her moment. She pulled out the bench and sat down. The murmurs in the audience faded. She could feel their eyes watching her every movement. Taking a steady breath, she reached out and flipped open the sheet music, and in that instant, a chill ran down her spine. The page in front of her was blank. No notes, no carefully memorized composition, just an empty sheet of paper. For a fleeting second, Her mind plummeted into a void. Did I bring the wrong one? Impossible. She flipped to the next page. Blank. Her eyes widened. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. No, no, this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. A quiet laugh rippled through the audience. At first, just a whisper. Then soft chuckles. And then, like a slow-growing wave, murmurs spread through the room. I knew it. A voice murmured somewhere in the crowd, "She doesn't belong here." Soft, but sharp as a knife. Amira's fingers curled into fists on her lap. She didn't need to turn around to know whose gaze was locked onto her. Vincent Aldridge. She flicked her eyes downward, and, just as she expected, he was watching her. A smirk. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. He had done this. He had switched out her music. He had planned this. She could picture him that morning, walking into the office, slipping her sheet music out of the folder. He had done it without hesitation, because to him, this was nothing more than a lesson. And now, he was waiting. Waiting for her to panic. Waiting for her to freeze, hands trembling in humiliation. Waiting for her to stammer out an apology to the judges for her own failure. Waiting for her to destroy her own chance. This was the final trap. But Vincent had miscalculated. He didn't know. Amara Lawson didn't need sheet music to play. She inhaled deeply, felt the air fill her lungs. Steady, her heart. How many times had she played without reading a single note? How many nights in that dimly lit church, when it was just her fingers and the music guiding her? How many times had she practiced until the melodies became part of her? Impossible to erase. She knew exactly what she had to do. She needed nothing but her hands, and the world was going to listen. Amara placed her fingers on the keys, and she began to play. The air in the auditorium froze. The stark white pages in front of Amara remained silent, offering no notes to guide her. For a brief moment, her mind spun. This was a calculated move. A final, decisive blow. Any other contestant would have panicked. But Amara was not just anyone. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath. Her palms hovered over the cold piano keys, her fingertips barely brushing against them. And in that moment, all the noise around her blurred into the background. The whispers, the quiet laughter. Vincent Aldridge watching her with that smug smirk. All of it faded away, like reflections on a fogged-up mirror. She didn't need sheet music. She never had. She didn't play by their rules. She played by her own. And then, the music began. L'étuve. First notes fell, soft as raindrops touching the surface of a still lake. A melody unfamiliar to everyone in the room, except her. Amira's music wasn't born from leather-bound songbooks. It wasn't shaped by Vincent's teachings. It wasn't confined by any structure they recognized. It was woven from her years, from Brooklyn, from the crowded streets bathed in golden streetlights, from the late nights in a dimly lit church, with an old piano and flickering candlelight. Her music told a story of a little girl sitting alone in the corner of a room, her fingers gliding over the keys while the world outside turned its back on her. A story of a mother who sacrificed everything so her daughter could chase her dream. A story of doubting stares, mocking whispers, the feeling of being an outsider in a world that was never built for her, and how she took all of it and turned it into something unstoppable. At first, the audience didn't realize what was happening. Some were still whispering. Vincent still lounged back in his seat, amusement dancing in his eyes. But then, she changed the rhythm. Her fingers moved faster. The notes no longer fell like gentle raindrops. They crashed like waves against the shore, relentless, powerful. She played as if she were fighting, and each note was a strike back. A strange silence began to settle over the auditorium. The murmurs died. The laughter vanished. Vincent no longer sat back in his seat. He leaned forward now, his eyes flashing with something between surprise and irritation. No one was laughing anymore. No one dared. All eyes were locked on Amara, as if they were witnessing something impossible. One of the judges slowly placed their pen down, their gaze fixed on her as if trying to commit this moment to memory. A few students in the crowd, the same ones who had once laughed at her, sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. And still, the music soared, burned, carved itself into every corner of the auditorium. Vincent's eyes never left her, but the smirk, it was gone. For the first time, he realized he had miscalculated. For the first time, he understood she wouldn't be erased as easily as he thought. For the first time, he was afraid, and Amara knew it. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the room had changed. She wasn't just playing music, she was rewriting how they saw her. The piece neared its final movement. The melody slowed, like a deep breath after a storm. The low notes rumbled, no longer weighted footsteps, but deliberate, steady marks, like a final signature etched into stone. And then, the last note rang out, lingering in the vast space. Silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Amara remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her breath evening out. She had done it. She had proved them wrong. She had turned this performance into a statement, and they would never forget this moment. The final note faded into silence, its echo stretching across the vast auditorium like a quiet ripple in still water. And then, nothing. An absolute, breathless stillness settled over the room, as if even the very walls were holding their breath. Not a sound, not a whisper, not a single murmur. Only Amara, still seated at the piano, her breath uneven but steady, her hands resting lightly on the cold keys. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what she had just poured into every note. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare look at the audience. For a fleeting moment, she felt as though she was suspended between two worlds, one where she had given everything to the music, and another where judgment awaited her. Had she done the right thing? Or had she ruined everything? Her mind was blank. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear nothing else. But then, a single sound cut through the silence. A slow, deliberate clap. Not from the audience, from the judge's table. A man stood, an older gentleman with silver-streaked hair, a face lined with the weight of time, yet eyes that remained sharp. Someone who had witnessed hundreds, maybe thousands of performances before this one. But now, he looked at Amara with something bordering on awe, as if even he had not anticipated what he had just witnessed. He raised his hands. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the hush like the first raindrops on dry earth. And then, as if the entire room had just woken from a trance, the auditorium erupted. Applause thundered through the space, crashing in waves from the front row to the farthest seats. Some people leaped to their feet, unable to contain their astonishment. More judges followed suit, whispering to each other in hushed, urgent tones, their eyes filled with something unmistakable. Recognition. At the edge of the stage, Mrs. Helen gave a small nod, her lips curling into a soft smile, not of surprise, but of pride. The students who had once sneered at Amara were now silent. The smirks, the quiet laughter, the dismissive glances, all gone. Some of them exchanged uneasy looks, as if uncertain how they were supposed to react now. Charlotte Hayes, the girl who had once mocked Amara the moment she first stepped into this school, clutched the fabric of her dress, her knuckles turning white. No one was whispering anymore. No one was saying she didn't belong. Because in this moment, every single person in the room was looking at her. Not with pity, not with condescension, but with undeniable acknowledgement. Amidst the deafening applause, Amara still hadn't moved. She still couldn't quite believe it. Her breath was still uneven. Had she really done it? But then, her gaze lifted, and she met his eyes. Vincent Aldrich. He hadn't moved. He hadn't clapped. He hadn't stood. He simply sat there, frozen in place, staring up at the stage, his body rigid, his hands pressed against his knees, fingers digging into the fabric of his pants. His face, always so composed, always carrying that effortless air of superiority, looked as if a mask had just cracked wide open. He said nothing, could say nothing, because every carefully laid plan he had orchestrated, every calculated move, from striking her name off the E list to switching out her sheet music at the last second, had just collapsed in front of him. Everything he had believed to be impossible had just unfolded into reality. But the worst part? The part that cut him deeper than anything else? It wasn't just that she had won. It was that he couldn't deny it. Music doesn't lie, and tonight, the entire auditorium had just witnessed a truth that could never be erased. Amara Lawson didn't just deserve to be here. She belonged here. She had claimed her place, not through wealth, not through privilege, but through raw talent, relentless passion, and an unbreakable heart. And though the applause roared on, echoing in her ears, it no longer mattered, because she didn't need their approval to know what she had accomplished. She only needed to know one thing: she had proved them wrong. The auditorium still pulsed with the weight of what had just happened. The applause had faded, but the echo of Amara's performance lingered in every heart, refusing to be forgotten. The elderly judge, the first to rise, the first to clap, stepped onto the stage, holding a small, intricately carved trophy. Light from the grand chandeliers above reflected off its polished surface, gleaming like a symbol of something far greater than victory. With a performance that was not just skill, but soul, emotion, and courage, the judge's voice carried. Through the silent room, I am honored to present this year's winner, Amara Lawson. The audience erupted once more, the applause crashing like waves against the walls. But this time, Amara didn't stand frozen in disbelief. This time, she stepped forward, steady, unshaken. She reached for the trophy, her fingers curling around. The cool metal, not as if it were a surprise, but as if it had always been hers to claim. Below the stage, Mrs. Helen smiled, pride shining in her eyes. In the back of the room, near the exit, her mother stood still, tears glistening but unshed, watching her daughter with a quiet, unshakable love. But as Amira's gaze swept across the crowd, she caught sight of something else. Vincent Aldridge, still seated, still motionless, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white, and his eyes, no longer filled with arrogance, no longer gleaming with quiet triumph, were empty. Because this was a defeat he could not rationalize. And then, without a word, without so much as a backward glance, he stood. He walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one cared. Because tonight, this wasn't his story anymore. Amira inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth of the stage lights on her skin. She reached for the microphone. The room fell into silence once more. And then she spoke. I used to believe talent was everything, that if you were good enough, if you worked hard enough, you would be given a chance. But I was wrong. She let the words settle, let them sink in. Because the truth is, sometimes the door doesn't open just because you knock. Sometimes the door was never built for you in the first place. A hushed stillness spread through the room. They told me there were stages I didn't belong on, that music had invisible boundaries I could never cross. But tonight, I played a piece with no sheet. Music. I played my story. And if music has taught me anything, it's that the truth cannot be silenced. Her eyes swept over the judges, over the students who had once laughed at her, over the people who had thought she didn't deserve to stand here. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." I am standing here, not just because I won a competition. I am standing here because I won against fear. I refused to let anyone else define my worth. A slow, almost imperceptible shiver ran through the room because they knew she was right. She wasn't just talking about music. She was talking about every child who had ever been shut out. Every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. Every voice that had ever been ignored simply because it wasn't the one they wanted to hear. Her voice was steady now, unshaken. I hope that after tonight, no one else will have to knock. I hope no one else will have to beg to be heard. Because instead of waiting for them to open the door, we will build our own stage. Silence. And then the entire room stood. The applause this time was not admiration. It was recognition, respect, a declaration, and Amira smiled. She had done it. She stepped down from the stage, weaving through the crowd. As the grand doors of the auditorium swung open, a rush of cool New York night air swept in, lifting loose strands of her hair. She looked up. The city stretched before her, towers rising high, lights flickering like thousands of distant stars. The road ahead was still long, but tonight she had taken the biggest step of her life, and she would never look back. Amira Lawson's story is not just about music. It is about resilience in the face of prejudice, about a girl who dared to stand against a system designed to push her aside, about how she turned obstacles into fuel, how she transformed mockery into stepping stones. She didn't just win a piano competition, she won a far greater battle, a battle for recognition, for a voice, for the truth that talent knows no boundaries, no class, no color. And most importantly, she became a beacon for thousands of others. Those who once believed the doors before them were locked shut. But the truth is, doors are not meant to be waited on. They are meant to be broken down. Thank you for following Amira Lawson's journey. This is more than just a story. It is a reflection of countless real lives, of people fighting every day for the opportunities they rightfully deserve. If this story spoke to you, like, share, and leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Stories of courage, of ordinary people rising to do the extraordinary. Let's spread this message together. Talent has no borders. Your voice deserves to be heard. If the door won't open, create your own path. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.